Yugoslav. I was born in London, half Armenian, half Italian. And I didn't have that much of a connection to Armenia, the country, but I was enrooted with a lot of my Armenianness by my mother, who spoke Armenian to me. I went to the Armenian school on Sundays and had teachers like Dikin Tamar over there. So I did have experience of Armenianness, but I didn't have much connection to the country of Armenia. And honestly, I wasn't following Armenia as much as I was other countries. Then that started to change, I would say around 2015, 2016. I started following Armenian politics and I got really interested in the country. I graduated university in 2018 from Exeter, and I registered to do Birthright Armenia, which I would recommend if you have people, friends, family, that even want to take just 3 months out to see Armenia, to connect with Armenia. It's actually a really good way to be introduced to the country. You meet Armenians from everywhere. I mean, I met Armenians from Santiago in Chile, from Tomsk and Novosibirsk in Russia, Ramallah in Palestine. So it was really interesting. It was like a microcosm of the diaspora. I volunteered most of my time in Gyumri, and I was teaching English in 2 schools in Gyumri. One was the Shirvanyan Center, and the other one was a number, I can't remember the number of the school, but it was a number. So I did Birthright, and at that point I had an interest in journalism, but I wasn't thinking at that point still that I would work as a journalist in Armenia. I came back to the UK for a few months, and then I wanted to go back to Armenia. So I went back, again with the aim of just traveling, learning about Armenia and all of that. And I met a producer at the Armenian Public TV who said, if you want to break into journalism, why not do that in Armenia? Because it's an interesting place to work as a journalist, etc. And she introduced me to Aren Melikian, which maybe some of you will know. He's a very great Armenian journalist, and he's now the editor of the Eastern Europe, yeah. So, which is amazing. I mean, he's gone to that editorial position, and I believe he's in Prague now. He gave me the email of the editor-in-chief of CivilNet, who is Garin Harutyunyan. So I met with Garin, and Garin as well was saying, if you want to break into journalism and you're interested in Armenia, why not try your hand at CivilNet and give us, a trial period of like 2 weeks, and then we'll see. Anyway, I did that, and they offered me the job, and then I decided to just stay in Armenia. And I spent 4 years working at CivilNet in Armenia until August of this year. So that was kind of my journey. It was never something I had planned in the long term. It happened. I don't regret it at all. But it happened very quickly. I met Aren. Aren introduced me to Garin, and then I started working. So I worked only a short time in the office, and then the pandemic started. Obviously, pandemic was at the start of 2020. So we were working from home, but the lockdown period in Armenia didn't last very, very long. And I think the first, real experience of journalism I had at CivilNet in Armenia was in July of 2020, when there was the skirmishes in Tavush region, Bertavan, Movses, these villages. At the time, Tatul Hagopian was working at CivilNet, so he was going on the ground. We were translating into Armenian, and they had a mission of developing the English content that's going out, because as Armenians, I think oftentimes we're speaking to each other rather than trying to amplify that message to outside audiences, that they are not going to be sitting and studying in depth the negotiation process with Azerbaijan, the treaties and all of that. So it's important for us to create content that is digestible, that they can view in English, but not only in English, in French, in Russian, in all sorts of languages. So even CivilNet, for example, has an English section, which has been going for a long time. Salpi Ghazarian, the founder of Civilnet, always thought it very important. Oh, look who. Very important to put focus on English. But there's also a Russian section, which is also important because a lot of Armenians are in Russia. There's a journalist from Krasnodar in Russia who left because of the invasion. She was an activist in Russia called Anya. She is now very involved in the Russian section, and now they're hoping to open a French section. Obviously, there's a lot of Armenians that speak French and Armenian, but maybe they don't speak English, so these are the things they're doing. Civilnet was very interesting also because, I mean, working now, it's very different journalism in the UK in that Civilnet was multimedia, and they literally allowed me to work in any sort of media I wanted, which for a Western media outlet is very unusual. So we were allowed to make photo stories, articles, op-eds, video reports, stand-ups, daily news briefs, podcast interviews, studio interviews, whereas usually a journalist like in the UK would be working on one of those, if not two. So the fact that I mean, if you even know a young journalist that wants to develop their skills, I would advise them to do that, because even now, for example, working at the BBC, I have just sent the content I made in Armenia to them, and that's why they wanted me to work, because they saw that I had worked in nearly all these different media formats, which is not usual. This is like something that is actually a really, really great opportunity for young journalists, and they're happy to take young journalists. They have young people from everywhere who are working on that. So there was the 2020 July clashes. When they happened was the first taster of what I see as the information front or information war. Obviously, there are the real people doing the real fighting on the ground, and that is of essential importance, but there is also the information front. And Azerbaijan has invested a huge amount in information, and they use different techniques to the ones used by the Armenians, but they're very important. So for example, the media in Armenia disseminates information about the conflict in Artsakh, or the conflict with Azerbaijan. In both countries, you're only really allowed to disseminate official information, which there is debate around that, whether that's a correct policy or not, but it's understandable why they do that, because I don't think Armenia had a developed press corps policy at the time of the 2020 war. And for example, if you look at Ukraine now, you can see that they've had a lot of help from the Europeans with how to organize their information front. So we were trying to create content in English. I also worked with the Armenian Defense Ministry, had their Office of Informed Citizens, I believe it's called, where we were disseminating information that was giving out Armenian evidence, for example, of the use of phosphorus gas by the Azerbaijani forces, which is banned by Geneva Convention, of Azerbaijan using Syrian mercenaries, which was whistleblowed by, actually I believe was whistleblowed by a Syrian mercenary, ironically, to a American journalist called Lindsay Snell. She kind of blew the whistle on that there was these flights coming in from Turkey that were full of Syrian men that were going to Baku. So I started to understand that in Armenia, unfortunately, a lot of the focus on journalism, especially journalists that are working around the conflict, is a lot of impact and importance is put on it because of the information war, because of the need to present the Armenian message, to inform audiences about what's happening. And if you take Azerbaijan, for example, Azerbaijan has been very successful in many ways in disseminating information, a lot of it disinformation, a lot of it misinformation as well. I mean, disinformation is the dissemination of information which is non-factual, which is not true. Whereas misinformation is the purposeful dissemination of false information. So they were even disseminating information which was not accurate, but was being disseminated anyway. For example, they were doing very interesting things, Azerbaijan. One was what could be described as caviar diplomacy, which is that Azerbaijan was, I don't know how, was building connections with certain Western journalists, with certain media outlets, not just Western but across the world, and having them publish articles. An example which I always remember is when the Artsakh blockade happened. You will remember there was these eco-protesters that were blocking, which, looking in hindsight, is so ridiculous that that's how it started. And it ended with the displacement of 100,000 plus people. But there were Western journalists that were looking at that story from the beginning from a purely environmentalist angle, and actually portraying that Azerbaijan is doing something unprecedented and something very interesting in terms of international law, and purely looking at it as an ecologist or environmentalist issue, which is crazy that they did that, because obviously we know what happened after. But I think that there must have been a lot of lobbying involved to do that. There must have been a lot of conversations that happened, because you could see in the writing there was no focus on the humanitarian angle when it comes to that. So that was very, very interesting. The Guardian even published an article which was purely focused on how Azerbaijani people have concerns about mining in Artsakh, even though we found out recently that Azerbaijan now plans to take over these mines and continue producing the metal ores in the way it was happening before. But they were very smart in realizing that a lot of those Western media outlets or journalists would be more interested in what's happening with the mines than what's happening with the 100,000 people that are fearing for their lives, for their homes, for their existence. Even remember, those eco-protesters were holding signs in English. They were using words like ecocide, pollution, saying that the authorities in Stepanakert were purposefully destroying the environment. Azerbaijan also has made very good connections with non-Western media outlets, which oftentimes I think Armenians focus on CNN and BBC and The Guardian and The Times and how they can produce a better message. But these are not the only media outlets in the world. For example, Azerbaijan has built a very good relationship with the Straits Times, which is based in Singapore and is heavily followed in Malaysia and Indonesia, and its content is all in English. And you can see from their content that they've done it just through consulting with an Azerbaijani perspective. So as, you know, Armenians, I think this is something interesting that we should think about, is Armenian messaging. Earlier, I forgot to mention, of course it's very important, but later, obviously, the Karabakh war erupts in September 2020, and then I started doing interviews with Eric Hagopian, which some of you may have seen his videos. Eric used to be a campaigner, used to work on political campaigns in America, and then repatriated with his family to Armenia. And then he did this Polytalks series on CivilNet. So we did a few interviews, and it was gaining, attention because there was not many people that were articulating what was happening in English. There was a lot of content in Armenian, and people in Armenia get their information. It is amazing how informed people are in Armenia on Armenian, subjects, on current affairs. But when you're someone who doesn't speak Armenian, where do you get that information? And how much time are you going to put into getting that information? So Eric and I were doing like 10, 12-minute interviews, and then he started the Insights with Eric Hakopian show, which I was producing, which was a weekly Armenian connected stories that he was doing to camera. So that's still going on, the Eric Hakopian show. But Eric would always talk about the importance of messaging and avoiding echo chambers, not just hearing our own perspectives within a room, but trying to find ways that our message will resonate with other groups. So for example, one thing I enjoy that Eric would say was that some people would say we shouldn't always harp on about Armenia being the first Christian nation. And he would say, well, hang on, actually, you should harp on about Armenia being the first Christian nation, but it depends which group you're targeting. So if you're talking to metropolitan liberals in London, it's not something that's going to really invigorate them. But if you're talking about the evangelical lobby in America that is heavily supportive of Israel, for example, because of biblical beliefs, that's the great group to say, hey, the first Christian nation is being attacked by a Muslim nation in the form of Azerbaijan. But if you take that message to a metropolitan liberal, as I said, they're not going to react in the same way. But then there's other things you could say them. You could say that Armenia is a very tolerant country in many ways compared to other countries. Armenia is in a much better human rights and democracy situation than Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is an autocracy where the last independent media outlet was shut down last week. So you have to target the messaging in certain ways for certain groups. And I thought that was really interesting. And understanding how information doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be all-encompassing. You can take what works with different groups. So for example, another interesting thing that the chief of CivilNet would say, Apo Borikyan, who is from Anjar in Lebanon, was that even with different countries, Armenian diplomatic corps and press corps should be pushing different narratives. So for example, with the Arab world, it's going to be different to Iran or Israel or the European Union. So these are things to bear in mind, is that what can we do to front or push the Armenian message in a more intelligent way. So Eric Hakopian is still doing his shows at CivilNet. I sadly left CivilNet in the end of August, and I moved back to the UK in September. I will hopefully be able to go back to Armenia one day to work as a journalist, but at the moment I'm here, and I'm still in touch with the people at CivilNet and with my friends in Armenia, and there are some really amazing journalists working in Armenia. There are some really amazing journalists working in Armenia. In the UK, if you had journalists, I wonder what percentage of those journalists can say, I have covered war. Probably not that much. But you have so many journalists in Armenia that have worked around conflict, which is very difficult, especially you have like international correspondents that would come in during 2020 war, like from Sky News, from Al Jazeera, whatever. But these people are, I remember one Sky News journalist would say, yeah, I'm in Karabakh this week, and then next week I go to Sudan to cover what looks like ethnic cleansing there, and then the next week I go to Myanmar Like for them, it's like a carousel. But for Armenian journalists who were working on the ground, it was very personal, very difficult. And you also have Armenian journalists working in fact-checking. In CivilNet, for example, there is the fact-check team, which was Hovo Nazaretian, Ani Krikorian, Haik Hovhannisyan, who would fact-check things, because in Armenia, especially because of the prominence of Facebook, there is a lot of issues with disinformation. And Telegram channels are another issue, but like we would have so many times information that would be circulated that was just not factual, and people would believe it. And there would be times where the state would kind of be in a state of clumsiness, because it was very difficult for them to organize what was the information that was official from other information. For example, some of you will remember the day Shushi fell under Azerbaijani control. There was a whole state of confusion in the days leading up to that. And that was primarily because of conflicting information reports, official information coming out and then being retracted. That is just an example of why we as Armenians need to attach importance to information. And viewing, for example, what's happening in Ukraine, Ukrainians have been a lot more successful. And there's debates that go around it. For example, do we let international journalists report as they want? This is an issue that is still up for debate. So during the 2020 war, the Armenian government was happy to have journalists from around the world go and report. But there was caveats. So some journalists said that they were very impressed with how the Armenian government and Artsakh government allowed them to film, to do whatever they want. But others were saying, I wasn't allowed to do everything I wanted. I was kept from certain places. So this is, I'm not saying there is a right or wrong, but there's a debate. For example, in Stepanakert, there was an Arabic TV channel that was filming, and at one point they noticed that they were filming military installations. They were filming military vehicles and things of a military nature. Now that footage, that video, could then be and will be viewed by the Azerbaijani side, who can then pinpoint where Armenian tanks are or where Armenian bases. So do we just say, because I understand that's an argument for the other side, do we just say, yeah, go film whatever you want? Or do we say, no, don't film whatever you want, we have to be next to you, This is one of the things, some of the debates which I'm just going to share with you all, because it's interesting. Like, for example, with that, I'm not sure. Some people say we should have, in 2020, just let these international journalists film and get what they wanted from wherever. But then I also understand the authorities that were saying, I don't trust like some random journalists to go and film in Askeran, which is a very important place militarily, and just do what they want. Even when we talk about Azerbaijan, also Azerbaijan is so proactive in the way they try and silence information. And I don't know if any of you knew this, but on Wednesday, a book launch on cultural heritage in Artsakh was cancelled in Berlin because of what we believe to be a pressure campaign by the Azerbaijani embassy. So even something like a book launch in Germany, they found out in advance it was happening, they found out in advance what was the content, and through their embassy, they got it cancelled. So it was actually at the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, which is ironic because even if Friedrich Ebert Foundation has been very proactive in Armenia, so has the Adenauer Foundation, so you would think they would have noticed that this is not really correct for them to cancel a book launch about cultural heritage. It was about monasteries and monuments, etc. So I want to not be too long and bore like the hell out of you all, but I just wanted to go through some of the interesting things about Armenian media. So as I said, there are many Armenian journalists that are incredible, but according to the CRRC, which is a very reputable organization, the Caucasus Research Resource Center, so they did like a poll, which they do many polls, on who do you trust and not trust, which is a very common question in polling. The Armenian media ranked last in the polling. So according to the polling, only 9% of people in Armenia said they trusted the media, and 55% said they don't trust the media. The number one spot was, in terms of trust, was the Ombudsman's office, which is now a lady called Anahit Manasyan, I believe, and the Army and the European Union. They ranked top 3. But at the bottom, the very last point is the media. So, and I noticed even at working in Armenia that when you would tell sometimes someone that you're a journalist, they wouldn't, like, here some people are like, oh, that's interesting, you're a journalist. A lot of times there they'd be like, you're great, you're a journalist, like Laura Grohes. And I remember even once there was a village in southern Armenia called Yelpin, and Azerbaijani forces had fired at the village. And so we went to do a video there, and when we arrived, the villagers came and met us, and they were like, you're journalists, you're just here to say that everything is a catastrophe when it's not, you're meddling, they weren't happy to see us, even though you would think that they would be happy that, journalists wants to cover this thing, but people are so mistrustful of journalism, and I think that's because for many years, journalism in Armenia, there are amazing journalists, but there's also a lot of problematic journalism in Armenia. There's a lot of disinformation, there's a lot of vested interests. So, I just want to go over a few types of media you have in Armenia. The first is pro-government media in Armenia, which exists. There's Arat News, there's Civic AM, there's Haikakan Jamanak. These are media outlets that are supportive of the government, and they are connected to politicians.
Are you showing something?
No. So they're connected to people who are in the government or allies of the government. The public TV is state, so it's like the BBC. So in the sense that it will always have some sort of influence from the state because it is the state media. Then you have the media which is more loyal to the former administrations in Armenia. So that's, for example, Yergir Media, 168, Kentron Channel. These are medias that are anti-government, but are more pro the previous administrations. The third one, which is a very interesting one, which a lot of people in Armenia are talking about at the moment, is Russian media. So Russian media has a big presence in Armenia and is usually followed by older Armenian media. And to understand what are some of the issues. The issues are where people get their information. I know even I get my information from Facebook, but Facebook can be quite problematic sometimes. You should develop what they're doing in Armenia, different workshops like Ani Krikorian does, which is like media literacy. How can I look at 10 different media posts and understand what is actually worth my time and what is probably problematic? Because I think Armenia has like a ridiculous amount of media outlets. There's loads of media outlets in Armenia, and a lot of them operate on like Telegram. There's also a lot of commentary and not a lot of analysis, which is another issue. You have a lot of opinion shows. Anyone can get their iPhone, their smartphone, go on TikTok or Instagram, make a live, just talk whatever they want, many times spread disinformation, which causes panic. I remember when September 2022, remember when Azerbaijani forces attacked Jermuk and other places in southern Armenia and Vayotspor. There was so much information coming in that how do you go through that information and take what is actually factual? Because they were shelling Jermuk, that was a fact. But then there were other things which weren't factual that were causing panic in other communities. So it's very important that we, as an Armenian community, develop, firstly, how we consume our information and how we disseminate information. And those are two very different things. So if there's anything I want you all to take from this is, one is how you consume your information when it comes to Armenia. I say it doesn't matter actually. I consume a lot of rubbish as well. I try and I watch a lot of stuff, good stuff and bad stuff, things that are factual or not factual. And then you yourself to try and take from it what is most probably factual, what can be backed up. Is this media source giving the same information as this media source, or are they giving two different pieces of information? So it's something you have to be conscious about. It's very difficult. All these media outlets around the world are focusing on that. BBC set up BBC Verify recently. There is other media outlets that are doing the same, because we don't know a lot of the times if the information is factual or not. And the other one to think about is how we disseminate our information. I think, I'm curious also, maybe people disagree, but I think that Armenians were very disappointed with the way global media covered what's been happening over the last few years. It didn't seem that it was, they thought editorially that it was that interesting maybe for their audiences. Maybe they thought that it was something that will be short one day and then it will stop. But I think that now, whether it's late or not, a lot of Armenians are putting an effort in disseminating information better, in disseminating information that resonates better with foreign audiences, and realizing the importance of that in the information struggle. That there is fighting on the ground, but there's also fighting on the airwaves, and that we need to develop our information front when it comes to that. So I have written a lot, but I feel like I've spoken way too much. So I'm happy to have a discussion with people if anyone has any questions they want to ask. I'm not an expert on media, just an FYI, nor am I a journalist that understands the ins and outs of information. But these are things I was observing from people working in media in Armenia, and they were saying that these things are very important, that we need to develop how we disseminate our information and how we combat the information campaigns coming out of Azerbaijan as well, because they have been very successful, like I said, in disseminating false information many times, covering up information they don't want disseminated, and portraying Armenia in a certain light. Like TRT is the state outlet in Turkey. Whenever there's chaos in Armenia, they broadcast it on their Arabic, Swahili, English. They are very, very proactive. So I'm happy to open the floor to questions, but these are just some things I'm hoping you'll leave thinking about, and maybe how we can better the situation when it comes to media, journalism, and information in Armenia.
Thank you. I'm going to allow Emilio to take some questions. He will